Good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much for the possibility to talk about this topic in one of your seminars. The title is Employment, Uncertainty and Fertility Trends in Italy, a Tale of the Last Decades. And yes, I'm going to present mainly results from two studies, which are, however, two work in progress. The first one is about labor market deregulation and fertility in Italy, and it's done with Professors Barbieri and Scherer from the University of Trento, and Professors Guetto and Vignoli from the University of Florence. While the second one is about female employment and fertility in Italy, and it's a work of mine. And trying to introduce both studies and talking about their shared background, I would say that it is an enduring finding that employment conditions influence life course transitions, including fertility, and the relationship between employment and fertility was proved to be particularly intriguing in Southern European countries, as several studies have showed, especially also some meta-analysis, because these countries are characterized, among other things, by persistent low fertility levels, strong labor market deregulation that took place over the last decades, and important recent changes in female employment condition and female employment participation. The two studies that I present today address these last two elements, taking Italy as a case study. So the first study is titled Labor Market Deregulation and Quasi-Completed Fertility in Italy. I will explain the reason behind this quasi later. And for those who are less familiar with the topic, the Italian labor market witnessed an extended period of deregulation that has started more or less in the late 80s with the introduction of the so-called work and training contracts and with less strict rules for fixed-term contracts. The deregulation then extended notably in the second half of the 1990s and during the early 2000s, when the use of the so-called non-standard employment forms, mostly in terms of fixed-term employment, has been facilitated and extended with the Treu law in 1997 and with the Biagi law in 2003. As in the rest of Europe, the aim of this deregulation was to foster employment, to improve employment, and to reduce unemployment, improving labor market entrance employability, especially among women and in the South. But what have been the actual effects of this deregulation on the labor market? Well, the reforms turned out to be partial and targeted, and generated a strong labor market dualism between protected insiders and unprotected outsiders, with young labor market entrants particularly at risk of remaining trapped in the secondary labor market segments, while conversely the core insider workforce has been somehow institutionally protected, institutionally sheltered by the deregulatory reforms. There is quite a lot of evidence that the labor market reforms ended up with effects that were contrary to the expectations of the legislator. For example, it was found that these reforms have actually made the entrance in the labor market faster, but they had only a honeymoon effect on employment rates. Then several permanent contracts were de facto replaced, substituted with temporary contracts. And finally, as a result, labor market careers as a whole have become more and more unstable and fragmented, especially for the tertiary educated. So what does the evidence available say about the relationship between labor market instability and fertility in Italy? Well, there is some evidence showing that women who had never worked before marriage have their first child earlier than those with work experience, or similarly that it was found higher first birth risk, among single earner couples where clearly the man is permanently employed compared to couples where both partners are permanently employed. But there are also studies suggesting slightly different evidence, for example, that women who are permanently employed have the highest first birth hazards, while the first birth risk is lower for women with atypical employment. There are even some more recent studies showing, for example, that among Italian couples, the man's stable job is a fundamental condition for fertility, while non-permanent employment for either of the two members of the couple depresses fertility. And another very recent study showing that jobs with uncertain conditions are responsible for some 7% of potential first birth postponement among women and 5% among men. The literature cited so far does not come without limitations, however, especially the one relying on event history analysis techniques. These studies, especially the one looking at transition to the first child, actually use right-censored individuals. Most of the youngest cohorts in these cases are aged less than 30-35. Second, studies using event history analysis mix timing and probability effects. So there are different effects at play. And as I said, usually the first child is the main focus, and higher order childbirths are often disregarded. So the study looked at the effect of individual experiences of fixed-term contract and not to the overall effect of the labor market deregulation. So the studies, as I said, focus on atypical work episodes and look at the effect of an instantaneous labor market transition on fertility transition, disregarding what can be the overall effect of the life careers that have become more and more precarious with the labor market deregulation. And now, I would say, as the cohorts affected by the deregulation policies started to reach the end of, did anyone say something? Okay, I'll go on. So I was saying that in these years, the cohorts affected by the deregulation policies started to reach the end of their reproductive period, and so it becomes possible to assess the consequences of the employment insecurity on completed fertility, thus considering also possible recuperation effects. So for this reason, the contribution of the study is to look at how labor market trajectories affect the number of children ever had. And with labor market trajectory, I include several indicators such as non-employment spell or the amount of time spent with time-limited contracts and other that I will introduce in the next slides. So I will use data from the Italian survey Family and Social Subjects, the WAVE 2016, conducted by the National Statistical Institute. And this survey allows studying quasi-completed fertility of women and men at age 41, thus born up to 1975 and born after 1951, because this survey includes very high quality retrospective information on labor market histories and fertility. The choice of age 41 as a threshold was made in order to get as close as possible to the end of individuals' reproductive age, and to include at the same time cohorts that are young enough to have experienced somehow the consequences of the deregulation reforms, studying their quasi-completed fertility, and quasi because clearly they have still some years to complete their fertility eventually, but most like most people by 41 have already had all their children. As I write in the note, the share of births from mothers older than 41 was only 1% in Italy in 2000 and grew up to 3.5% in 2016. It is quite a bit higher among men, but still it remains under the 10%. And yes, lastly, we excluded individuals born before 1951 because they really did not experience in any way the labor market's deregulation process. And we use two sets of analysis. The first one, including event history analysis, to replicate basically the previous studies, but with more recent data. And the second set of analysis, we use the multinomial logistic regression for the number of children at 41, which is what we call quasi-completed fertility. And yeah, for time reasons, I will not show and discuss here the results from the event history analysis, which is very, generally speaking, in line with previous study. And I will focus on the new part of the study, which is the one about the multinomial logistic regression. So we run models separately by gender and cohorts, and especially we distinguish between two cohorts group, those who were born between 1951 and 65, and those who were born between 1966 and 1975. We reasonably hypothesize that cohorts 1951 to 65 have experienced virtually no labor market deregulation or in a very light and indirect way, while the younger cohorts have been increasingly exposed at least to the early stages of the deregulation reforms. The dependent variable is the number of children at 41, which we grouped into three categories, 0, 1, and 2 plus, and this allows us, using one child as the reference category, to interpret the effect of the model in terms of comparison on the effect of the variable on the probability of being childless and on the probability of having two or more children, keeping one child as the reference category. As the main independent variables relate to the labor market history, and we use a set of indicators describing individuals' labor market trajectories, such as the number of employment spells of any kind and duration experienced between 15 and 41 years of age, the time spent with a typical employment contracts in the same age span, and finally the number of non-employment spells longer than three months. I have to make a note here and say that we talk about non-employment spells because it is not possible to distinguish properly between unemployment and inactivity. So non-employment spells, in this case, are considered as intervals between two employment spells. And in order to differentiate between unemployment and inactivity, we look at the reason why the non-employment spell has begun. And we distinguish between non-employment spells begun with a voluntary work interruption. For example, if someone wants to stop working to look after children, or the desire to change job, and non-employment spells began with involuntary work interruption, for example, in case of dismissal or end of the contract. And finally, I forgot to write that we also control for the duration before the first significant job experience after completing education, to account somehow for the first unemployment spell, the one before the first significant job experience, which can be quite long in Italy. As control variables, we have several variables about the family background. So we control for both parents' educational level, if parents have ever separated or divorced, if parents have ever married, both parents' age at the respondent births, and their social class measured with the European socioeconomic categories in six categories. classification in 6 categories. And finally, we control for the number of siblings. And also we have some controls about individual characteristics. We control if the respondent was born in Italy or abroad, for the respondent educational level, and the macro area of residence at the time of the interview. Finally, missing values to control variables were imputed through multiple imputation by chain equations. And anyway, the share of missing values was relatively low, from ranging from 0 to 4%. Here are the results. I know that these kind of large tables are not really the most intuitive way to illustrate the results of a study, but I will briefly guide you through a couple of important results, and then I will quickly move on to the second part of the results. And this table shows the average marginal effects of the variables related to the labor market on the probability of being childless, which is the 0 column, and on the probability of having 2 or more children, which is the 2+ column, because our reference category is having only 1 child. There are 4 models, men and women among the older cohorts on the left-hand side of the table, who are those who have experienced virtually no labor market deregulation, and men and women among the younger cohorts on the right-hand side of the table. If you look at the variable number of employment spell, for example, among women, you see that among the younger cohorts, the variable is almost unrelated to fertility, as there is no significant effect, while among the more recent cohorts, the number of employment spells become strongly related to women's fertility outcome. For example, a woman who has had 5 employment spells or more is 14.7 percentage points less likely to have 2 or more children compared to a woman who has had only 1 employment spell. And similarly, the variable about the number of months spent with atypical contracts between age 15 and 41 is not significantly related to men and women's fertility outcomes among the old cohorts, not even if we look at the most extreme values, which is 48 months or more, but it becomes significantly related to childbearing among the younger individuals, and not only among men, as you can see, but also, albeit weakly, among women. So, for example, a man who spent 4 years or more with atypical contracts is 9.5 percentage points more likely to be childless at age 41 compared to someone who spent less than 1 year with atypical employment. And finally, as regards involuntary work interruptions that we can roughly approximate to unemployment spells, if you want, they are especially detrimental for men's fertility, both for the young and for the old cohorts, despite among the younger cohorts, effects, the magnitude of effects is slightly larger. So, but as I said, to illustrate better the findings presented so far, we computed predicted probabilities of being childless and having 2 or more children at 41, separately by gender and cohort for 2 profiles. So these 2 profiles here are profile A and profile B. Profile A is someone who found their first significant job 4 years after completing school and had 3 employment spells, 2 involuntary non-employment spells, and spent 4 years or more with atypical employment. This is clearly a profile corresponding to a precarious career. Conversely, profile B found their first significant job between 2 years after education. This person had only 1 employment spell without non-employment spells, and during the whole career spent less than 1 year with atypical employment. So this profile B is something that we can call a relatively stable employment career. And Yes, so the histogram here show predicted probabilities for the two profiles separately by gender and cohorts. And I would say it is quite easy to notice that the precarious profile is always associated to a higher probability of being childless and to a lower probability of having two or more children compared to the stable profile. And an interesting finding is that if you look at the difference in the probability of having two or more children between the precarious and the stable profile among the older cohorts, you see that such difference is significant among men, but not significant among women. But the difference for women becomes significant too among the younger cohorts. And actually, all the gaps in the predicted probabilities have somehow exacerbated among the younger cohorts. And in general, having a precarious employment career is related to lower fertility for men and women, especially among the more recent cohorts. The effect of career instability, as you can see, is particularly evident when we look at the probability of being childless among men, which changes drastically depending on the working profile among recent cohorts. Yeah, to conclude, I mean, finally, in line with what I said about the results from the multi-logit models, it seems that gender differences in the relationship between employment trajectory and fertility have reduced among the youngest cohorts, providing further evidence of gender convergence, or a partial gender convergence. So to conclude, I would summarize saying that employment insecurity definitely affects fertility decision, precisely with higher risks to remain childless and to have fewer children among those who had any, and not only looking at simple single labor market transition, but also with this larger look, with this whole look at the whole employment career. Effects are stronger among men and, as to be expected, become much stronger for the younger cohort. Conversely, effects are smaller among women and suggest that a stronger labor market attachment in general is associated with lower fertility. Yet, we can say that our own employment situation gains importance also among women, especially among the younger cohorts. And these documented employment effects add to the existing cohort trends. And these, as a result, taken all together, exacerbate further the fertility decline. So I let's say that if this one was a lecture with a class of students, this would be a good point to suggest a break, because I would be afraid that they would fall asleep. But I hope I'll be able to keep your interest up for some more minutes. And yeah, and as well, there are no more tables with multinomial logistic models ahead. And so I passed to the second study. With the second study, I still talk about the relationship between employment and fertility. We are still in Italy, but I would like to move the focus from the consequences of the labor market deregulation to the female participation to the labor market, and thus the relationship between female employment and fertility. When we talk about female employment and fertility, the starting point is always in the studies about the country level correlation between female employment and fertility. And these studies suggest that while a negative association between female labor force participation and fertility was the norm in the past, starting from the mid-80s, this trend reversed in most Western countries. And since that time, we observe higher fertility rates in countries with higher shares of women participating to the labor force. In this framework, Italy is usually considered as an exception because the negative relationship between fertility and participation to the labor market has weakened only slightly. And I would say that it does not come as a surprise that Italy is an exception, because we know that fertility responds positively to increased female labor force participation only, or at least especially, in countries where childbearing is supported by institutions that promote reconciliation between work and motherhood, and by gender equitable attitudes within couples. And talking about the Italian context, as regard female employment, Italy is generally characterized by low female labor force participation rates compared to most other European countries. However, remarkable differences, I would say, exist between the northern and central regions and the southern regions. As it is shown in the figure, the increase in female employment rates at the national level was driven by the northern and central regions, where female employment rates almost reached 60% in the recent years. While in the southern regions, the percentage floats around 30% in 2016, like it used to do in 1980. The geographical gradient applies also to fertility, with southern regions that have typically showed higher fertility rates compared to the northern regions. However, when fertility reduced, at least at the national level, this gap, as you can see, has narrowed. And starting from the mid-2000s, higher fertility rates were observed in the northern regions. The reversal in the Italian regional fertility trends was analyzed by Vitali and Billari, 2017, and the authors, among other things, studied the relationship between several indicators and the total fertility rates at a local level. And they noticed that the relationship between the gender gap in the labor market and the total fertility rate was negative until 2010, but then it became positive, but only in the northern countries, in the northern regions. Similarly, Mincarini and Vignoli in 2018 looked at the regional level correlation between the employment rates of women aged 20 to 64 and the total fertility rate, and they found, as you can see in the figure, that the relationship is positive in the northern and central regions, characterized by better chances of reconciling work and family, and by a more family-friendly institutional context, while it is negative, this correlation, in the southern regions, suggesting that the reversal in the employment and female employment fertility nexus took place also in Italy, but it looks like it is still incomplete. So the figure is in Italian, but should be quite clear. On the x-axis, you have the TFR. On the y-axis, you have the female employment rate. And the dots are the 20 Italian regions. And the full line is the, let's say, the country level tendency line. But the two dashed lines are referred to the northern and central region, the one with a positive slope, and to the southern region, the one with the negative slope, showing that higher fertility are found in regions with lower female labor force participation. And what about the micro level here? So there are various theoretical perspectives on the relationship between female employment and fertility. I will just very briefly summarize a couple of them here. And one could expect a positive relation between female employment and fertility through the income effect, because the demand for children increases as income increases in the Beckerian perspective. There could also be a negative effect of female employment on fertility through the so-called substitution effect, namely when income increases, the opportunity cost for having children also increases. And finally, there is also another hypothesis that gains relevance in the Italian context, especially the so-called role incompatibility hypothesis, saying that fertility may decline as a response to female labor force participation rates that becomes higher because of the difficulties of reconciling the demand for child rearing and the requisites for employment. And micro-level evidence also in this case is available about the female employment fertility nexus, and it suggests that a negative relationship insofar was found in most cases, as for example, Vignoli et al. 2012 found that employment is hardly compatible with childbearing for women, while male stable employment is a very important condition for fertility. Busetta and Gianbalvo found that for Italian women, being employed represents a risk factor for the postponement of the first birth. And finally, there is this work by Valentina Tocchioni, who identified the typical life course trajectories of childless men and women in Italy, and found that childless women are more likely to participate in the labor market, while the opposite holds for men. But what is the what are some of the limits of this existing micro-level research? Well, mainly all these studies rely on data collected in 2009, which is the previous wave available of the Family and Social Survey. Social subjects survey. So these data are, let's say, relatively old, and no attention was paid towards a potential reverse in the female employment fertility nexus. And second, very scarce attention was given to the regional heterogeneity, which was proved to be non-negligible in the Italian context. So the aim of this study is to look at the relationship between female employment and fertility in Italy, to test first if such relationship has changed over time, and second if it is homogeneous across the two main macro areas of the country. The section about data and methods will be very quick, because I will be using the same data described for the first work. So data again come from the Family and Social Subject 2016, and I will use the retrospective information on labor market and fertility. This time I only selected women born between 1950 and 1998, and I will use event history analysis to study the transition to parenthood, so a Cox model, where women entry at the risk of having their first child at 16, and they are censored at 49, or whenever they have their first child. I run separate models by macro areas. So as I said, I basically divide the dataset into two, north and central regions versus southern regions. The main independent variable is employment status, considered as a binary variable, so employed, not employed. And the control variables includes parents' educational level, the number of siblings, the region of residence, the place of birth, distinguishing between Italy and abroad, and also a couple of time-varying variables, one about educational level, and the second one about the calendar period, which I divided into roughly into decades. So we have the time before 1980, 1980-89, 1990-99, 2000-2009, and the last time span, which goes from 2010 to the most recent year available in the survey, which is 2016. Finally, I will exploit this interaction term between employment status and calendar year to look at how the relationship between female employment and transition to motherhood has changed over time. So the first result that I show is a simple event history analysis on the transition to motherhood run on the whole country, and then separately by macro areas. I reported only the hazard ratios for the variable about employment, and these results, I would say, suggest that if we look at the national level, employment is still negatively related to transition to motherhood. But replicating the model separately by macro area of residence, I find that this relationship turns out to be significant only in the southern region. However, as I said before, these results represent some sort of a average effect through the different time spans included in the model. So the next step is to make an interaction between the variable about employment and that about the calendar period, and to look at what has happened to the relationship between employment and transition to motherhood among Italian women. So the baseline term suggests a strong negative effect of employment on transition to motherhood, or at least this was the case before 1980s. Because if we look at the country level, so the first column in red, the introduction terms indicates that such relationship has become less and less negative, and actually it became positive in the last time interval, namely between 2010 and 2016. And all these interaction terms are significant already starting from the 1990s. The model specific by macro area suggests that this transformation has taken place both in northern and southern Italy, but possibly, let's say, with different timings. So while in the northern and central regions, the interaction terms are always significant already from the 1980s, in the model for southern regions, it is, we can say, only the last term, the one about 2010, 2016, which is significant. So, I mean, I'm paying attention not to overinterpret these coefficients, but we can reasonably posit that the reverse might have taken place in the northern and central regions before, first, and then in the southern regions. So to give graphical representation of the results at the country level, the figure shows the relative hazard of transition to motherhood over time for employed and non-employed women in Italy. As you can see, the risk of having the first child was significantly higher for non-working women in the past, before the 1980s for sure. And then the difference between employed and non-employed women has reduced over time. And in the last time span, if you can see, namely after 2010, the trend is actually reversed, and employed women show a significantly higher hazard of transition to motherhood compared to their non-employed counterpart. So to conclude, I would say that the relationship between employment and fertility, or at least transition to motherhood here, is turning its sign also in Italy, and has become positive, at least in the very last years. Differences between North and South exist, but I would say that they are not as large as one may expect. In light of the magnitude and in light of the deep roots of the North-South gradient in Italy, all things considered, I would say that the differences in the employment-fertility nexus between the North and the South might have become narrower in the most recent years than they were in the past. And so, bearing in mind that men's participation to the labor market is still the norm in Italy, these findings confirm that the dual earner model is becoming more and more widespread in the country, and that probably it is starting to be positively associated to fertility, possibly also as a result of the strong increase in the educational attainment and labor market participation of women in the last decades. However, identifying the reasons, the causes of the change, of this change in the sign of the correlation between female employment and fertility in Italy is quite complicated. And in light of the results of this study, my guess is, I would not say that employment positively relates to fertility through an income effect, because in this case, I would expect the effect to be quite larger in the southern regions, which are economically more disadvantaged. So I would say that rather it could be the case that new gender roles are spreading in Italy, and they are likely to have started from the northern and central regions, which would be in line with the result from the interaction model. So the new gender roles may entail gender equitable attitudes within couples, and these attitudes is reconciling work and family life. ultimately allowing a positive effect of female labor force participation on fertility, or again, only transition to motherhood here. So the title was Tale of the Last Decades, and the question is there is a happy ending to this tale. Well, I would say that the story is still developing, and if there is a lesson here, is the confirmation that relevant, remarkable changes in the labor market, also those who take place over time, do not come without consequences on fertility. And these two studies focused on two such changes, namely the strong labor market deregulation that has started during the 80s in Italy, and the female labor force participation. And I think that these studies produced evidence of their relevance for fertility dynamics. I think they give a nice contribution to the literature insofar as the first one provides a new perspective on the employment uncertainty fertility nexus, because it looks at the consequences of a labor market deregulation on completed fertility as a whole, so rather than on single transitions. And the second one, the second study, moves the focus on the female employment fertility nexus from the macro perspective to the micro level. And this provides new results for a rather old-style context like Italy. So interestingly, the two studies share some findings, especially to the extent that both, for example, indicate that over the last years, the last decades, employment status and the condition of women is gaining importance for fertility outcomes, also, and finally, in the Italian context. Certainly, both studies come with some limitations, which I didn't discuss appropriately so far, but we can talk about that later in the discussion, and I will be more than happy to collect your comments about them or your suggestions to improve these two works. And thank you very much for the attention.